Hey there, my name is Timothy Roberts. I'm an independent cymbalsmith, and in this video, I'm going to show you the process of hammering a profile into a cymbal. Now, last week I posted a video all about cymbal profiles, and I had a ton of examples. It was probably way too long of a video, and I rambled on quite a bit about each cymbal, but now I want to show you how I actually go about creating the shape in a cymbal. And I'm going to take two of the blanks that were from the hand-formed bells video, and we're going to work on them today, and I'll show you the process of that. So first off, I've got this is about 21.5 inches currently, and it has one of the hand-formed bells. I noted this in the hand-formed bell video, but when you use the method that I use to create these hand-formed bells, you actually start drawing the shape. You start pulling the whole metal, the whole blank up into a shape, so you can kind of see that we've got a profile happening a little bit, and that's because of that bell formation. I've got this huge dip right here that you might be able to see from the opposite side. Got a big hump there. I've got a lot of wild shape things to deal with, but we are kind of headed in the right direction. So I think the weight on this one for being 21.5 is, I think it's around 2,600 grams. Then I've got this one, which is, I would imagine, 23.5 inches. And it weighs 3,055 grams. Yeah, the diameter is about 22.75 inch on this one. So 22, 3/4, 3,055 grams. Medium weight. This one also has a little bit of a profile that's been drawn up just because of the bell formation. And so now I'm going to talk about and show you hammering these cymbals and what I do to actually get the kind of shape that I want. So in the profile video, I talked all about the curvature, where it curves and how that affects the sound. With both of these, and really with all the blanks that I work on, I start by getting a basic shape. And really that shape is, I'm looking for something that's uniform, fairly medium low, and I'm getting it into a place where I can go ahead and edge the cymbal, because this cymbal, being that it was a totally flat blank, it's got a very ragged edge, and so I need to cut the circle perfectly. And to do that, I need like a uniform low shape. I start with that, and then from there I go on and build it up into the shape that I want. And yeah, I'm gonna just start hammering, and you'll kind of see what I do with this. But basically, I'm going to be working with top hammering and bottom hammering. The bottom hammering is to give the cymbal support and structure. The top hammering is to sort of stretch tension into it. If you only hammer the bottom, you get a really crazy taco shape. And so you have to hammer the top and the bottom in conjunction with each other to keep the amount of stiffness you want in the cymbal, and also get it to start umbrellaing into the desired shape. So let's start swinging a hammer. Alright, so as you can kind of see there, I did a pass on the underside, and then I started on the top and sort of went in between my strikes that I did from the underside. So I used two different hammers. I've got a big Turkish hammer here. It's 2 pounds, more of a point to it, so it's got a more ability to, or a better ability to deform the metal, move the metal. And then this hammer is also Turkish, but I've polished it to have a little bit more of a flat face. So it has a wider strike surface and still about 2 pounds as well. So you've got more force being concentrated into a smaller area here, which can deform the metal, and same weight but more of a surface area, which is kind of compressing the metal. So you have the difference in what I call deformation versus compression work. Deformation is about really getting the metal to move fast. Compression work is about building in strength that causes the whole thing to kind of grow in a more uniform way, because you're not putting as much force into a small strike surface. You're kind of spreading out that strike surface. And then with the top hammering, I was doing a bit more density. So it was more dense, more of a spread out surface. I'm kind of trying to get more of a uniform growth to the metal. And so at this point, I've got the cymbal flipped inside out, but I can flip it back in the right way, and we have ourselves what is becoming a shape, a nice low shape. You can't really see it through the camera, but it's got kind of a bend down on this side. And at this point, I am going to do another round of compression hammering on the top. And I'm going to have it flipped the right way, hammering the top. So the goal is to grow it up into a better shape. Then I'm going to flip it over, hammer the underside a little bit to kind of iron out where it wants to dip and have softness, like where it's popping right there. It's going to need more work out near the edge. But this is getting me fairly close to being able to edge the cymbal, and then from there take it to the desired shape that I have. Alright, so let's check this out. You can see how I've got the density up to about here in the cymbal, and now we have much more of a shape starting to happen. It's kind of hard to see on the camera, but it really is starting to be drawn up in the center. And this kind of shape right here is what I talk about when I talk about triangular shapes, where you have this pretty hard line that almost starts here, ends at the bell. And this can be a nice shape for a crash cymbal. It can be a nice shape for a ride if it has enough weight on it. It has a certain characteristic that tends to be a bit more smooth. With cymbals that have more of an arc out, or big curvature out near the playing surface, out at the edge, basically about halfway up the cymbal all the way to the edge. If it has more of an arc here, that's when you're going to get a little bit more of a choked sound, a little bit more of a more complex sound, more dirty sound, a little bit more, a little bit more complex is the best way of saying it. So right now, I'm going to basically continue this density out all the way to the edge, which is going to take this portion and sort of build it up here, which is, I really want this section to be built up in a way that's going to give the cymbal stick definition, because that's where a lot of that stick definition comes from, is about this section where my hand is. And so having that have a nice curvature like this, as opposed to being flat or even dipped in, is essential to have a stick that feels pretty solid and beefy and doesn't feel hollow or mushy or slow to respond. any kind of cymbal that has flat portions, and if you're playing on those flatter portions, they tend to almost have like an inward trajectory to them. So you kind of want them to have more of an outward trajectory so they're able to meet your stick in a way that creates a solid stick sound. That's obviously for ride cymbals, but I make pretty much every cymbal I make is meant to be sort of a crash ride. You can crash it, you can ride it, you can do everything with it. I kind of go by the Elvin Jones mantra of every cymbal is a crash, every cymbal is a ride. And so even with these cymbals that have strong curvatures out here, there's other ways to design the cymbal to where it has a nice crash. So if you're a rock and roll guy and you need something that you're just going to crash on, you know, you're going to go with typically a smaller size, and it's fine to have a really low shape, and it's fine to have a sense of flatness out near the edge, because you want that, because that's going to give the cymbal more spread and more sustain. But there are certainly ways to have a cymbal that's balanced really beautifully to give you both ride qualities and crash qualities. So what I'm going to do now, you can see I switched hammers. This is also a very flat face. So this is, again, compression work meant to grow the metal into the shape. And the deformation work is done with a more pointed hammer. So what I'm going to do here is, you know, I can attack this a number of ways to get the kind of curvature I want out near the edge. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come on the underside, and I'm going to give myself a pretty solid ring. Basically halfway between where I stopped hammering and the edge. I'm going to give myself a solid ring on the underside here. And this is going to be kind of like a support structure that's going to go up to really enforce and reinforce the hammering I'll then do on top to give myself the nice curvature so that this can be a nice ride cymbal. So. All right, so we now have a fully shaped or initially shaped blank. I've got a plenty flat profile, like it's pretty even all the way around to where I could easily edge this thing on the lathe. And I've actually got a really nice curvature that is kind of billowing out like I was talking about, which is great for a ride cymbal. So one of the things I wanted to show with the technique on this cymbal especially is if you kind of look at, I know it's going to be sped up, but if you look at the amount of hammering I did on the bottom versus the top, I really did not hammer the bottom very much at all. And I was able to do this for a couple of different reasons. First reason was my hand-formed bell had already sort of stretched things and started moving things this direction and giving me a shape. So when I went in to do the hammering, I used a lot of force. I was really swinging that heavy hammer. And you can kind of still see, let's see if we can get up close here, all of the dots like here, 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 that's the underside hammering. And so you can see how sparse it is. It's really sparse compared to what I did on top. And this is like the most simple way I find to get a shape fast. I have not been spending long on this cymbal, and it's already pretty much shaped. Now I'm going to lose some height, profile height, when I edge the cymbal. Because obviously I'll be cutting down the edge, so I'm kind of moving the bottom of the cymbal up this way. So I'm losing some height, which is fine. But this initial shaping like this gives me enough compression to sort of iron out lumps and bumps and weird stuff. And it gives me enough to work with so that I can, after the edging, I can come back and do my second round of hammering. Or sometimes I'll shave a little bit of weight off because the brown crust on these cymbals is more dense. It's harder than the raw bronze underneath. So just shaving off the material, the top material, will actually give me a softer material to work that will move a little bit easier. This gets into something that I believe is a Mike Skiba thing, great independent cymbalsmith that is no longer with us, unfortunately. But on the Cymbalholic forum, he would post stuff about the layers of bronze. And, if you can think of, zoom in and say this is how thick your bronze is. When I'm hammering on top, I'm compressing this top layer of bronze, but I still have a fairly significant amount, depending on how heavy the blank is, I have a pretty significant amount of softer material that's underneath the material that has been work hardened. So an example of this is if I were to take a really heavy blank, shape it, and then lay the ton of weight off of it, it's going to have a super mushy feel. It's going to be very ill-defined, and it's not going to have a lot of sustain relatively, because I've basically shaved away all of the compressed, work-hardened bronze, and what's left over is just the softer core of the bronze in the middle. So that's a huge thing to take into account when hammering these cymbals is kind of knowing ahead of time how much lathing I'm going to be doing. Given that this cymbal is the one that's 3,055 grams, and it's 23 and 3/4 inches big. When I get that down to 22 inches, I'm going to lose a fair amount of weight. So when it's edged to 22, I'd imagine I'll probably be sitting around 2,800 grams. So 200 or 300 grams. Between 200 and 300 grams would be my guess is what I'm going to lose. So I'm going to have a 22 inch. Let's say it lands right at 2,700 grams. Then at that point, this cymbal in particular, I'm kind of aiming for a 2,500 gram range. And I'm not going to, I could do this in a number of ways. I could keep hammering the cymbal, let it rest maybe for a day, come back, hammer it again, get the exact shape I want, edge it, lathe it, done. But because I know I'm going to be wanting to lathe at least 200 or 300 grams, I want to take it in stages. So what I want to do is I want to edge it. Then I want to maybe remove the crust. So I've opened up raw bronze. Then I'm going to hammer again to raise the shape more. Then I can remove some weight, possibly hammer again, remove some weight. That way I'm compressing the outer portion of the bronze and giving myself the stick feel that I want while getting it down to the weight that I want and not getting into too soft of a bronze core that's really not going to respond the way that I want it to. So put this one aside. I'm going to move on to number 2. The reason I picked 2 of them was because I wanted to show 2 different techniques of hammering. You saw when I was hammering, I have this technique that no one taught me. This is just something I kind of picked up on my own, where with my left arm, I'm spinning the cymbal clockwise, and with my right arm, I'm hammering in a circle. And it's kind of a band, so it's a connected band. So I try to end where I started, but then I also kind of turn it into a spiral. So it's kind of a blend between these connected circles that expand outwards and just one really, really tight spiral that goes all the way around. And this, to me, gives me a really really controllable and understandable way of knowing exactly what I'm going to be doing to the bronze. You saw me do that. So now with the second cymbal, I'm going to go with a completely different technique, which you've probably seen if you've ever watched other cymbalsmiths hammer, which is kind of this in and out way of hammering where I'm hammering and then my left arm is moving the cymbal in and out at the same time as spinning it. This is a little bit more of a, it's a different technique, and it requires it's a little bit harder to kind of know where you are from the standpoint of the maker. It's a little bit more randomized. It's not as calculated. It's not as easy to go. I've hammered it exactly the way I want to hammer it all the way around. So we'll get into that now, and it'll probably take a little bit longer to shape this one because of the technique that I'm using. But I really love this initial technique I showed you is my favorite technique to get shape. I feel like it's understandable for my simple mind, and I know that I can do relatively minimal hammering on the bottom and just take the top hammering and really do it dense to just stretch that material over top of these structural supports I've put in from the underside, and I'm able to get, relatively good shapes relatively fast. All right, so change up plan. So I did this hammering here, and I got myself right up butted up underneath this bump. But the problem is as I go around and as I get onto the actual bump itself, I'm gonna have quite a bit of air underneath my blank, between my blank and my anvil, which is not good. You don't want to have a ton of air. You can use distance and space and a little bit of air to really get the metal to move, but too much air and you can push the metal too far and it can crack. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move to that in and out thing I was telling you about. And what this is going to do is it's going to cause, if you can imagine this being like dough or clay, I'm basically with this kind of hammering, I'm going to be kneading it like across and kind of working it out all the way across the cymbal. And by the time I get to this area here, I'll be able to slowly work out the big bump. And by the time I get back to my start point, I should be able to have ironed it out and flipping it over to do the top hammering. All right, so we got ourselves a nice little taco. I sort of ironed out a little bit of that bump, but it's still there. This is something that many early new cymbalsmiths run into, is that if they get a bump or a lump or a weird place in the bronze, they will just work it, try to get it out, and then you overprocess one part of the material, and you end up kind of moving the problems elsewhere. And you end up chasing bumps and lumps and all that kind of stuff. So I committed to having the same sort of density all the way around. And even though I don't have this lump entirely ironed out, I'm going to flip this thing inside out, start hammering the top. And I know that through going at it kind of methodically, step by step, I know I'm going to be able to deal with that and get a good shape. So let's now look how it is right now. It looks ridiculous. Sounds ridiculous too. I'm going to turn this thing and I'm going to get this thing into a shape. So with my next round of hammering, it's going to be top hammering. I might go from the bell out to the edge multiple times. I'm really going to have to get a lot of density and really build that shape in, because obviously right now it's wild and crazy. So All right, let's see where we're at after that. So now you can see it's pretty uniform flipped inside out. Let's see what happens when I flip it the right way. All right, well, we're way less U-shaped for sure. Got some hooks and dives in weird places. I still got this big lump and bump in the center, but it's way less huge. So it's like, the way to think of it is pretty much is if you're hammering into a flat surface, what it wants to do at a certain point when the hammering is when you're using a more a wider surface area hammer, what it wants to do at first is it wants to kind of grow into your hammer. So it kind of wants to billow up like this. If you use more force or a more pointed hammer, it wants to kind of push down, and everything around it wants to kind of gather up around it. So when there's no hammering on the top surface and I just hammered the bottom, you saw the whole thing U'd in a pretty massive way. Then I flip the cymbal inside out, densely hammer the top surface, and that U is, that U like this is much more, it's drawn up into a better shape. So we're on our way to having a usable shape, but this needs more hammering before I'm going to be able to trim it. Now we got a U the other way, but when I flip this thing the other way, I'll be willing to bet we have a much better shape to work with. So cool. So yeah, we're working with a much better shape now. I've got a nice, what I would call that triangular thing going on. And this is the way this is turning out, just having to spend the extra time to iron out that lump in the metal is making for this cymbal to be a good candidate for a taller profile. So something that goes up a little bit higher. I've got one like big bump on one side, like a bump on this side where it kind of flattens out on this side. So at this point, I'm gonna have to go in and do some very targeted hammering to kind of iron out, because this is where the bump was, and it's bumped more than the opposite side, which is giving me kind of a wonky shape. So at this point, I'm going to dive in and just do some very specific hammering to certain areas to kind of build out certain areas and even things out. And this thing is definitely going to end up being a tall profile cymbal. I got an even shape. It was bumped on one side. Now that shape's kind of ironed out. When I get into that zone where I'm kind of doing specific hammering and it's not about uniform all the way around the same amount, I get into kind of a flow state with it, where I'm responding to the metal. I'm watching how the light is reflecting off of the bronze to see where I have little lumps and bumps, and I'm kind of just getting into a flow state, like I said. And that's been many years in the making. Being able to do that has taken many years and many thousands of hammer strikes. But this cymbal is going to make for a really nice taller shape cymbal, I believe. I think I might keep it as a 21 inch. So really I'm only going to be cutting I'm going to be marking basically a 1/4 inch from the inside to just cut down a 1/2 inch of the whole diameter so that it's a 21 inch cymbal. And from there, it'll get some lathing, obviously. I don't know how much more hammering I'm going to need to do because this is already a fairly tall shape, but I could see wanting to build out the halfway through the cymbal down to the edge. I could see wanting to build that out a little bit more maybe. But we've got ourselves a nice tall shape. And the last thing I want to just discuss really quick is what happens to the metal right after hammering like this. Can't explain fully why this is the case, but what happens is the metal gets kind of seized up. The molecules are shocked by the cold forming that I'm doing via hammering. And so right after the hammering, you get this significantly dry sound to the cymbal that takes at the very minimum about 6 hours, upwards to like a week to relax and open up. So the sound right now on this cymbal incredibly dry, incredibly choked sounding. And when I hit this thing, if I were to come back and hit this thing tomorrow, it's going to have a lot more life and shimmer and airiness to it. Whereas right now it just kind of sounds like a hunk of metal. So cymbal smiths need to account for the alloy resting, letting the alloy do its thing and rest so it can open back up. When I get to the end of my process on making cymbals like this, what I do is I let the metal rest for sometimes upwards of 2 or 3 weeks even, and then I revisit it. And sometimes when it's fully rested, it can kind of open up and it sort of reveal problems. So if there's a hum or a certain soft spot, sometimes after like a month, if you just make a cymbal, put it aside, it can have a really strong shape, strength all the way around up near the bell. Come back to it a month later and the bell has kind of sunken in a little bit, which is very common if you've bought any cymbals from any of the Turkish manufacturers. Not to call out any ones in particular, but they're making those cymbals and they're just kind of hammering them, lathing them, and sending them on. And especially if they're kind of a medium low shape, many times that bell will sort of sink as the metal has fully rested. And so I get a lot of Turkish brand cymbals that come into my shop for modifications, and it really just takes a little bit of work to the section, about halfway up the cymbal up to the bell. It just takes a little bit of work there to strengthen that area, and then it's sounding great. So that's why I like to let my cymbals really have time to rest and really have time to go through their process of opening up so that I can really see what's going on and make any final adjustments that are needed. So with both of these cymbals, you saw I did some of those ribs or bands on the underside to add strength. I really, with the initial shaping, typically I'm not trying to go for hard hooks. I'll usually do that halfway through the process. So say with this cymbal, since this one's taller, say with this cymbal, I get to the end and I build up a little bit more strength around the bell, and I'm like, I really would love it for the edge to have a nice hook. In that case, what I'll do is one of two things. There's ways of pushing the metal where you want it to go, and there's ways of growing the metal. And I've kind of alluded to this a little bit with what I've said before, but there's ways of pushing the metal into a direction and then growing it out. And that's kind of that thing where it's like you'll strike the hammer on the metal, and initially it wants to kind of grow into your hammer strike, but the more you press it through, it wants to kind of, and everything else billow around it. It's kind of that same concept. So if I wanted to take this cymbal and I wanted to give it a hard hook at the edge, I would go on the underside, and I'd probably, just to be accurate with it, I'd probably put it on my lathe and give it a Sharpie mark so I know exactly where I want that line to be. I'd go in and I'd hammer that line, but after I do that, I wouldn't just stop there because that kind of heavy hammering on the underside can loosen things off to where you sort of make your profile out of whack. So what I'll do then is go on top And I can use a wide face hammer and actually hammer on top of those strikes. Sort of on top of them, but sort of in between them. And the goal with that is actually to start that growing process, to sort of grow it into that shape, which when you're growing a shape into the hammer, it gives you a more stiffness and it gives you a stronger shape. Whereas when you're doing the pushing method, it's very easy to pass a threshold and kind of cause the whole thing to slump. So I'm going to do, when I do those kinds of hard hooks at the edge, I'm usually doing some underside structural work to give it the tendency to want to dip. But then the majority of the work I'm doing is just extra hammering on the top to sort of grow that hook that I invited via the underside, grow it into shape and make it strong in that shape rather than weak, if that makes sense. So I know that was a lot, but please drop any comments of questions you might have on this process. One thing I didn't mention that I'll mention right now is that I do try to avoid the strikes from the opposite side of the cymbal. So, on this cymbal here, I had those very, very heavy strikes. Can still be seen here, like that guy, that guy, that guy. Those are all strikes from the underside of the cymbal. When I'm hammering on top, for the most part, I'm avoiding those areas. So I'm able to see a darker shade in the alloy, and I can kind of avoid it. And the reason I can see a darker shade is because I'm using a different hammer. So I went from my pointed Turkish hammer to my rounded flat hammer. So I'm getting a more faded hammer strike, and you can see like these more faded looking ones are with the wider hammer. And this is a really great thing to be aware of. It takes a lot of time to get to this point where you can be aware of this, but being able to kind of avoid those strikes at times, and sometimes you don't avoid them. So sometimes I'll use these wide surface area hammers, and I want to go over top of those heavy strikes on the bottom. And because I'm using that different kind of hammer with the spread out wider surface area, I'm not just negating the work. I'm kind of inviting it to continue. I'm inviting more shape to be built into the bronze. So that was my last little point of that. But yes, please let me know what you think of this video. Drop a comment below. And let me know if you have any questions about cymbal profiles. And again, if you haven't checked it out, the video I posted previous to this one is a video all about cymbal profiles, and I'm playing them and discussing different ones and showing you, like, it was probably like 8 or 9 different cymbals that I showed you and talked about why they sounded the way they sounded. And I really dealt with the exact kind of curvature, whereas do you have more curve out towards the edge? Does it flatten off towards the top? Do you have hooks? Do you have various things? Is it triangular and smooth, or kind of like jagged and all over the place? That's where I really get into that topic. But this video is simply about showing the process of hammering. And last thing I'll say, to oversimplify it, if I wanted to take this cymbal and make it more triangular, I'd hammer more up towards the bell. If I wanted to make it more flat up at the bell and more curved out towards the edge, I'd hammer more out towards the edge. It's simple as that. There's more. There's a little bit more to it than just that, but that's a way to boil it down simply. So that's how I go about getting the micro variances in the different shapes that I have, which I do that after my edging and after the initial lathing. And when I'm going into that second round of hammering is really where I'm dialing in that kind of shape. So enough blabber. There's just too much to talk about with cymbals. It's overwhelming, but also incredibly inspiring to me. So drop a comment below. Let me know what you think. Hit the subscribe and the bell if you want notifications, and keep an eye out for the next video. I'm Timothy Roberts. Thanks so much for watching.